So, Mehlaka, thank you very much for hosting this excellent event and inviting me to speak. I also want to thank both Sahar and Nazia for such excellent presentations. Uh, I'm going to basically try to do in 10 minutes something which is very difficult, which is try to understand and explain US foreign policy responses after September 11th. There are two things that I want to say about US response to 9/11. Number one, for the American security elite, the people who are part of the American foreign policy establishment on both sides of the party, the military-industrial complex, etc. This was a huge shock. What happened? This was a unipolar moment. America was unchallenged internationally. The Soviet Union had collapsed, so there was nobody that could compete with America militarily, economically, and the international system more or less reflected values which were conducive to America's hegemony. So, in its moment of extreme primacy, the US was attacked as never before. So, this failure for a security failure came as a huge shock to the security establishment. They were shaken at the core. That was the instant response, and not understanding fully as to what was going to be the extent of this attack, etc. The initial reactions were essentially being shocked at the vulnerability of the United States at the moment when it thought it was uniquely powerful, the most powerful state in the history, and then it was attacked in such spectacular fashion. And the second point that I want to make is that we have had huge discussions about what led to it and what we should do about it. And I remember in those days, I was an assistant professor on the margins of this discussion, trying to get a word in. But one thing that seemed apparent was that the American foreign policy elite was neither willing to acknowledge nor understand that September 11th attack was a consequence to the United States global hegemony. The US was practicing a sense of domination in many parts of the world, including the Muslim world, and this asymmetrical response to America's domination, particularly in the Middle East, was a reaction to American foreign policy. They wanted to see it as completely different, nothing to do with American foreign policy. And therefore, because there was no acknowledgement that our foreign policy may have contributed in some ways to what happened on September 11, we simply doubled down and just put the same foreign policy on steroids. So, what we were doing before 9/11, which is in technical terms, we say extra regional hegemony was being practiced by the US, especially in the Middle East and South Asia and the Muslim world. We simply doubled down on that. So there were a range of explanations trying to explain what really caused September 11, why did 9/11 happen. The first explanation was it is the fault of Islam. Islam as a religion, Islam as a civilization. So you heard of the clash of civilizations argument, which was made by Sam Huntington, initially advanced by Bernard Lewis. So they said, look, this prophecy of the clash of civilizations is coming true. Islam is to blame. Islam is a religion which is anachronistic. It has not adjusted to the modern world, nation states, democracy, modernity, gender rights, etc. So it is Islam's fault, and 9/11 is essentially an expression of Muslims' inability to come to terms with modernity. The second explanation was that, well, it's not actually Islam. They're all very friendly Muslims, especially with the US, etc. There are moderate Muslims, there are secular Muslims, etc. The problem is with what we call as radical Islam, not all of Islam. So radical Islam is anti-West, anti-Israel, anti-women, anti-human rights, anti-democracy. And so essentially what caused September 11 was a clash of ideologies between the neoliberalism that the US was pushing, democracy, human rights, open markets, and whatever radical Islam was to them. The third explanation was saying that, well, this is a failure of Arab states, dictators. They haven't provided any benefit to their populations, so the disenchantment of Arab populations, especially in states like Egypt, is the reason why there is terrorism, broadly speaking, and the 9/11 is essentially an attempt to exclude the US from the Middle East so that there can be reforms in the Arab states. And then the fourth explanation was the US foreign policy is to blame. And there were these people like John Esposito and others. And I was in this camp to a great extent saying, look, it's our foreign policy which is to blame, and we need to rectify, we need to have a reformed foreign policy. It's not about Islam, it's about US foreign policy, the way we engage. So, for example, Saddam Hussein was a dictator for decades, but there were no suicide bombing in Iraq, but the US shows up and then we have suicide bombings. The same in Afghanistan. There were no suicide bombings in Afghanistan during the entire war with the Soviet Union. The US shows up and then we see terrorism. So there's something to do with US foreign policy which needs to be critically discussed. And then the final explanation was that, well, it's nothing to do with Islam or idea. It's about capitalism and globalization, the winners and losers of globalization. And Nazia kind of explained this position quite brilliantly as to how we can understand September 11th as essentially a rejection of the economic order of the world, not just in the US, but globally also. So, who were these people who were saying these things? So, the way I characterize them is the people who blamed Islam were the conservatives, people who blame radical Islam were the neocons. The failure of Arab states was attributed by the realists, and then academics who were more on the liberal side of the politics started talking about U.S. foreign policy and the need to reform U.S. foreign policy, and then there were the what we call as progressive left, which was talking about capitalism and globalization as a reason why September 11th really happened. So I have done an extensive study of this. There's so much literature out there on 9/11 that it is not possible. So I actually did a report. I want to show it to you. It's called "These Five Perspectives on Islam by U.S." And so I took the work of Bernard Lewis to understand how Islam was blamed for 9/11. Daniel Pipes is the poster child of the neocons who try to blame what people like Ted Cruz and others today use the phrase radical Islam to imply. And then it was Fareed Zakaria who basically talked about the states. He's a realist thinker and he wanted basically reform of Arab states as a solution. It was John Esposito and his group of liberal academics who really made the case that American foreign policy was essentially responsible for this. And then, of course, Edward Said is one of the persons who talked about the inequities as a result of globalization that resulted in September 11. Edward Said did not live too long after that, so he was not very prominent. But there were other economists and others who did make this point consistently. But I chose to speak about Edward Said more as a homage to him than anything else. But what were their solutions? So when Bernard Lewis says Islam is the problem, the solution was to reform Islam. Islam must reform in order to make itself uh, 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 compatible with contemporary times or the American hegemonic order. People like the neocons basically were more interested in two things: the regime change and also destroying and eliminating political Islam and radical Islam. So the thing that we have to understand is, as far as the American foreign policy elite was, they were not only worried about the fact that America had suddenly been, its vulnerabilities had been exposed by non state actors, but also that America's hegemony was being questioned. So, so their response really of the neocons was that, look, this is a great opportunity to go back and reform the world and reassert American empire and America's hegemony worldwide. And so let's go into Iraq and other places and establish regimes which are willing to carry water for the United States in the region. So essentially, it became as reassertion and empire building exercise rather than ensuring that the US will remain secure. So even the war in Afghanistan was not just about going after Al Qaeda, but also creating a forward base from which US hegemony could be projected, US power could be projected in the region, South Asia, and the Middle East. And then you have people like Fareed Zakaria who understood that the neocons were trying to do and said that is not in the interest of the US. What we need to do is essentially democratize the Arab world, especially Egypt and other states. But the liberals continue to say, look, US foreign policy is the problem. If we continue to be hegemonic and so aggressive, waging wars which are unjustified and even illegal, The war in Iraq was definitely illegal. John Stewart said something very incredible about the war on Iraq. He said the next country America is going to attack is Canada, because Canada is exactly like Iraq. It has nothing to do with 9/11 and has no weapons of mass destruction. So the academics were making this point that what the US needs to do is not only rethink its foreign policy, but also to genuinely allow democratic movements in the Middle East, particularly political Islamic movements like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and others, which were non-violent and pro-democracy, to thrive and to grow, and not try to crush the only democratic movements in the Muslim world in the name of radical Islam. And then, of course, the discussion about reforming capitalism. Uh, it is only now, with the rise of Bernie Sanders, that we are seeing a little bit more serious discussion of left leaning policy with Elizabeth Warren and others. But during 9/11 and in this aftermath in Washington, this particular perspective did not get much attention, even though in academia it did have much voice. So the global war on terror essentially was supposed to do two things. It was to end terrorism, eliminate Al Qaeda and other security threats, and also reestablish US hegemony. So we went into Afghanistan to go after Al Qaeda, but also to the public demanded some kind of a military response to a military attack. And so Afghanistan was the target, and it was justifiable in many ways because Al Qaeda was based there and so on. But the Iraq war was just about reasserting US hegemony, not only in the Middle East and the larger Muslim world, but also to let the rest of the world know how powerful America is. And so the shock and awe strategy was not just to shock and awe Iraq, but also to shock and awe China and Russia, etc. So it was basically an exercise in reestablishing American empire whose vulnerabilities were exposed. Ironically, 20 years later, the Taliban have done in the same spectacular fashion, expose the vulnerability and limits of US military by basically kicking the US out of Afghanistan. So the US foreign policy report card, as a result of September 11, I think these are the points that I have. You can judge to give it a pass, fail, A, B, C, D, or E. One, it did diminish Al Qaeda, no doubt about it. Number two, it enhanced counterterrorism capabilities. The US has new technologies, and as Sahar pointed out, a new legal system which helps it uh, target whoever they deem as terrorists. I hope that some of these enhanced counterterrorism capabilities will serve the United States as we combat white nationalism and white terrorism, which we saw show itself on January 6th in such a spectacular fashion. But the same foreign policy also gave birth to ISIS. It destabilized the Arab world and South Asia. It even destabilized the United States. So even though we may not have external terrorism threats, but we have extremely high levels of internal terrorism threats. We could have had a situation where extremists could have lynched our vice president right there on television. And he was lucky that Pence got away with it. But one of the bigger consequences is the rise of global Islamophobia. This is a direct consequence of the US response to 9/11, and it is going to create a lot of disharmony, not just in the US, but also in Europe and in India, also, where tropes have been generated which are now used to demonize Islam and Muslims and justify policies which marginalize them and undermine their human rights. But one final thing that has happened as a result of September 11, that the United States is now a much weaker state, both militarily and economically, but it's also not as respected and as admired world over as it used to be in the past. So, in the sense that it has become a weaker state in the material sense, and in the ideational sense, its hegemony was also weakened. I have two papers whose I will share the link. This report, which is available as a PDF free, and this article, which talks about post-Orientalism and geopolitics, the debates after 9/11, which shaped US foreign policy. I will share the links in the chat with all of those who are interested in it. And one final thing, I have a YouTube channel called Conversations. Please subscribe to it if you like to listen to the kind of things I talk about. And Melika, over to you.